There is a testimony recorded in 1895 that almost no one cites today. It was not written by a storyteller. It was set down by Franz Boas, a government-contracted ethnographer working under the Bureau of American Ethnology. He was working in the middle of a federally enforced silence. The man who gave the testimony had two names. One was the name his community knew him by. The other was the name the outside record used. He described a creature with two heads. Each head faced a direction opposite to the other. The body moved through water without disturbing the surface. The scales reflected light in a way that made witnesses question what they had seen. The creature was called the Sisiutl. By the time Boas wrote it down, 11 years had already passed since the Canadian government made it illegal to speak of it in ceremony. What Boas captured was not the full account. It was what remained after a decade of enforced silence. By the end of this documentary, you will know what was recorded and who recorded it. You will know what the man in that room chose not to say. And you will know why that choice still shapes what the outside world knows about the Sisiutl today. The Kwakwaka'wakw have lived along the northern coast of what is now British Columbia for thousands of years. Their territory spans the northeastern corner of Vancouver Island, the adjacent mainland inlets, and a scattering of islands that outsiders still struggle to navigate without local knowledge. The landscape is not gentle. Channels narrow between walls of fir and cedar that block the sun for months. Tides run fast enough to capsize boats. Fog holds for days without lifting. To move through this coastline safely, you needed knowledge that took generations to build. The Kwakwaka'wakw built it. They encoded it into ceremonies, crests, architecture, and oral traditions. None of those systems were separate. A crest on a housepost was a territorial claim. A song performed at a ceremony was a legal document. A creature depicted on a mask was a record of the knowledge the creature represented. The potlatch was the mechanism through which all of this knowledge transferred. Not just food and goods, knowledge. Lineage histories, territorial rights, the names of dangerous places, the protocols for engaging with what lived in the water. A potlatch was a legal proceeding, a library transfer, and a public record simultaneously. Witnesses at a potlatch were the equivalent of a notary. Their presence transformed a declaration into a binding fact. When the Canadian government banned it in 1884, they did not simply prohibit a celebration. They shut down the entire knowledge transmission infrastructure of a people who had no written alternative. Every transfer that had been scheduled was suspended. Every inheritance waiting for the right ceremony had no path forward. Every protocol that could only be legitimately conveyed through the potlatch system was now a criminal act, indefinitely, under penalty of arrest. The Sisiutl sat at the center of that infrastructure. It was not a peripheral creature invoked to keep children away from the water's edge. It was a primary figure in Kwakwaka'wakw cosmology. It was present at the highest ranks of ceremonial knowledge. It was associated with the most powerful hereditary positions. It appeared on the most significant ceremonial objects the culture produced: masks, houseposts, coppers, feast dishes. These were not decorative objects. They were records. They marked the boundary between ordinary life and the knowledge that governed it. That is the creature whose testimony Boas was trying to record in 1895, 11 years into a federal silence. The Sisiutl's form is specific. Witnesses across generations described it with enough consistency that the details can be laid out plainly. It has two heads. Each head faces a direction opposite to the other. They are connected by a body that moves through salt water and fresh water with equal ease. The central portion of the body sometimes carries a human face. That face is positioned between the two animal heads, looking outward. The scales are hard and reflective. They produce a visual distortion, a shimmer, a doubling of the image that makes accurate perception of the creature's size and distance difficult. Some accounts describe the ability to change shape entirely. Others focus on movement. The Sisiutl travels without wake. It produces no surface disturbance. A body of that size moving through water should leave a trace. This one does not. It inhabits the boundary zones, the places where salt water meets fresh water, where rivers enter the sea, where tide creates a meeting of opposing currents. These threshold spaces were precisely where Kwakwaka'wakw territorial knowledge was most specific and most carefully guarded. A boundary between water systems was also a boundary between territorial jurisdictions, between hereditary responsibilities, between the zones where different lineages held different rights. The Sisiutl's habitat was not incidental to its function. It lived where the most consequential lines were drawn. To encounter the Sisiutl unprepared was understood to produce one of two outcomes. The witness died, or the witness was transformed. Granted a power that came at a cost the outside record never fully documented. The creature's role in ceremony was not decorative. The highest-ranking warriors were understood to have survived an encounter with the Sisiutl and returned changed. The proof of that survival was itself ceremonially transferred. To claim the knowledge that survival conferred, the experience had to be witnessed, acknowledged, and formally received by a community that had the authority to recognize it. That recognition happened through the Potlatch. Without the Potlatch, the recognition could not occur. Without the recognition, the knowledge could not legitimately transfer. The Sisiutl was embedded in that chain at every level. It was not possible to understand the creature without understanding the system, and it was not possible to access the system after 1884 without violating federal law. Masks depicting the Sisiutl are mechanically complex. They are hinged in ways that allow the outer face to split and reveal an interior figure during ceremony. Strings control the mechanism from behind. The carver had to understand the ceremonial sequence in order to design the mechanism correctly. The dancer had to understand the ceremonial sequence in order to operate it at the right moment. The audience had to understand the ceremonial sequence in order to read what the transformation meant. Every person in that chain required knowledge that could only be transmitted through the Potlatch system. When the ban came into effect, the transmission of that knowledge began to break. Not all at once, but consistently, and in ways that the objects themselves record. Museum collections document this breakage with a precision that is difficult to argue with. Objects collected before 1884 carry formal characteristics that differ consistently from objects collected after 1884. The proportional relationship between the two heads is different. The positioning of the central human face is different. The arrangement of formal elements that distinguish a Sisiutl representation from other supernatural figures is different. These are not random stylistic variations. They appear consistently across objects produced in different communities, by different carvers, in different locations, over the same time period. Researchers who have studied these collections in detail have reached a consistent conclusion. Post-ban objects show evidence of carvers working from memory and from partial information rather than from active ceremonial instruction. The knowledge encoded in the objects was degrading into real time, visibly in the formal properties of the objects themselves. The 1884 ban produced a material record of its own damage. George Hunt was the man who made most of Boas's work possible. His position was unlike any other in the ethnographic record of that period. His father was a Scottish Hudson's Bay Company factor stationed at Fort Rupert. His mother was a high-ranking Tlingit woman. He had been raised among the Kwakwaka'wakw from early childhood. He spoke Kwakwala as a first language. He had been adopted into the community through ceremonial means and held a recognized social position within it. He was not an interpreter in the ordinary sense of the word. He was a community member who also worked for Boas. That double position defined everything about what the outside record ultimately received. He knew what Boas wanted. He also knew what his community had decided. In the middle of a federal ban on the ceremonies that contained the relevant information was not available for transfer. Some things Hunt gave to the record. Some things he shaped before giving them. Simplified, recontextualized, stripped of the operational specificity that would have made them dangerous. Some things he withheld entirely. Boas knew this was happening. He was not naive about it. In his correspondence with colleagues at the Bureau of American Ethnology, he described Hunt as the most valuable source he had ever worked with. He also described him as the most significant constraint he had ever encountered in the field. The 1897 publication, The Social Organization and the Secret Societies of the Sisiutl Indians, is what survived that negotiation. It remains the foundational outside document on Kwakwaka'wakw ceremonial life. It is also, by Boas's own acknowledgement in his private correspondence, a partial account. What Boas published about the Sisiutl captured the creature's form accurately. The double heads, the central human face, the association with transformation and power, the connection to water and to threshold spaces, the ceremonial contexts in which the Sisiutl appeared. All of that is in the 1897 text, supported by the objects Boas collected and the accounts Hunt provided. What is not in the text is the territorial knowledge, the specific locations, the names of the threshold zones, the protocols for approaching them, the hereditary lineages responsible for managing them, the rights attached to those lineages, the obligations they carried, and the specific ways in which the Sisiutl's presence in those locations was understood to enforce and record those rights. That information was not accidentally omitted. The decision about what to give and what to hold back was made deliberately, by a man who understood both sides of the exchange better than anyone else in the room. That deliberate withholding is itself a historical event. It has a date. It has named participants. It sits inside a documented federal suppression that provides the structural reason for it. The outside record captured the creature's form. It did not capture the creature's function. The gap between those two things is where the real history of the Sisiutl lives. The Potlatch ban was not a sudden or isolated policy decision. It emerged from a specific legislative project that the Canadian government applied systematically to Indigenous ceremonial life in the late 19th century. The amendment to the Indian Act that criminalized the potlatch was passed in 1884. It defined participation in a potlatch or a tamanawas, a spirit dance ceremony, as a misdemeanor. The architects of the policy were explicit about their reasoning. Potlatches redistributed wealth in ways that did not conform to individual property accumulation. They transferred goods in patterns that the settler economy could not easily absorb or monitor. The ceremonial redistribution of goods was reframed as waste, as an obstacle to civilization, as something that had to stop. What the architects of the policy did not understand, or chose not to understand, was that the goods were not the point. The goods were the medium. The potlatch was not primarily an economic event. It was an epistemological one. The goods that moved at a potlatch were the material through which legal and territorial knowledge transferred between generations. A copper given at a potlatch was not simply a valuable object. It was a witness declaration, acknowledged by everyone present, recorded in the memory of every witness, and binding on the lineages that had participated. When the government banned the movement of those goods, they banned the mechanism through which knowledge was authenticated. The outside record describes the ban in economic and assimilationist terms. The Kwakwaka'wakw described it in terms of what it actually was: the criminalization of their library. The Sisiutl was not a peripheral item in that library. It was a load-bearing element. The creature's presence in specific locations, the protocols for behavior in those locations, the hereditary rights attached to those protocols, the lineages responsible for maintaining those rights. All of it moved through the ceremonial system that the ban had targeted. When Boas arrived 11 years after the ban, what he encountered was a community that had been managing this loss for over a decade. Some knowledge had been transmitted in covert ceremonies held in remote locations. Some had been held privately by hereditary chiefs who understood the moment for its transfer had not yet come. Some had already begun to degrade because the conditions under which it could be accurately transmitted had been legally destroyed. George Hunt sat between Boas and that reality. He translated what he judged could safely be translated. He withheld what he judged could not move without causing damage to his community, to the knowledge itself, or to the people who still held it. Boas understood this intellectually. It frustrated him in practice. In his correspondence with Hunt over the years that followed the 1895 fieldwork, Boas returned again and again to the same specific points about the Sisiutl. He asked about particular ceremonial contexts. He asked about the territorial associations. He asked about the geography of the threshold zones where the creature was understood to operate. Each time, Hunt provided something: a ceremonial detail, a formal description, a parallel from another tradition that was accurate as far as it went, and stopped before it reached the operational knowledge Boas was actually pursuing. The deflections are documented. They are in the correspondence archive held at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. They are not ambiguous. Hunt was not confused about what Boas was asking. He knew exactly what was being requested, and each time he chose not to provide it. Those letters represent something that the published ethnographic record rarely contains: a documented record of a knowledge holder deciding, in real time, what the outside record was permitted to have. Most ethnographic refusals are invisible. The knowledge holder simply does not speak. The researcher notes an absence and moves on. Hunt's situation produced something structurally different: a written record of the negotiation itself. Boas asked. Hunt answered, but partially. And Boas wrote about the gap in his own correspondence. He named it explicitly. He acknowledged that what he had published was incomplete. The incompleteness, he wrote, was located specifically in the relationship between the Sisiutl and the geography of Kwakwaka'wakw territorial waters. The question of whether that information could ever be obtained Boas wrote in a letter dated several years after the 1897 publication, depended entirely on what Hunt decided to do with it. Boas never obtained it. The question the correspondence raises is not whether the withholding was justified. It plainly was. The question it raises is what the withholding cost the outside record, and what that cost has meant for every subsequent researcher who worked from the 1897 publication without reading the correspondence alongside it. The published text presents a complete seeming account. The correspondence reveals the negotiations that shaped it. Together, they describe not just what Boas learned about the Sisiutl, but where he was stopped, and by whom, and under what conditions, and why. Many of the objects Boas collected are now in institutions far from the territories that produced them. The American Museum of Natural History in New York holds a substantial collection. So does the Field Museum in Chicago, the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, and the Smithsonian in Washington. The collection circumstances were varied. Some objects were purchased from individuals who had the authority to sell them. Others were purchased from individuals who did not. Some were collected under conditions that the communities that produced them do not regard as legitimate transfers. The collection histories are complicated and contested, and many are still being renegotiated through repatriation processes that began in the late 20th century and have not yet concluded. What the collected objects preserve, regardless of how they were obtained, is a formal record of the Sisiutl's visual language at a specific historical moment. The proportions, the positioning of the heads, the treatment of the central face, the formal elements that distinguish a Sisiutl mask from other ceremonial objects. These are documented in 3 dimensions: in objects that predate the 1884 ban and in objects produced after it. The comparison between the 2 sets produces a forensic picture of what the ban did to the transmission of knowledge over time. Pre-ban objects are formally consistent with each other across wide geographic and social distances. Evidence of active, functioning transmission. Post-ban objects show increasing formal variation. Evidence of a transmission system degrading under sustained legal pressure. Boas saw both sets. He documented both sets. He did not, in 1897, frame the formal differences in terms of knowledge degradation. That framing came from later researchers working with both the published ethnography and the museum collections together. But the evidence Boas collected was sufficient to support it. What Boas published, combined with the Hunt correspondence and the museum objects that bracket the 1884 ban, creates a layered archival record of a specific process: the deliberate legal destruction of a knowledge transmission system, the partial capture of what that system contained by an outsider who understood he was getting less than the whole, and the visible, material evidence of that partiality in the formal properties of the objects themselves. The 1884 ban was eventually repealed. The Indian Act was amended in 1951, removing the potlatch prohibition that had stood for 67 years. By that point, the Kwakwaka'wakw had held covert potlatches throughout the ban period. Ceremonies conducted in remote locations, without the public scale that the full ceremony required, but ceremonies nonetheless. Knowledge survived. Not all of it survived in the form it had held before 1884. Some survived in transformed versions, adapted to the constraints of covert transmission. Some survived in the memories of elders who were the last people to have received it through the full, unbroken ceremonial system before the ban came into effect. Some survived in the objects themselves, held by institutions that did not always understand what they held. the Umista Cultural Center, established in Alert Bay in 1980, was built specifically to receive objects repatriated from the collections that had acquired them under ban period conditions. Those objects came back. The knowledge encoded in them has been in a process of active recovery ever since. That recovery is being led by the communities themselves on their own terms, without obligation to the outside record that captured partial versions of what those objects meant. The Sisiutl is part of that recovery. It was never simply a story. It was a structural element of a knowledge system that survived federal criminalization and the degradation that comes from transmitting complex knowledge under conditions designed to prevent it. What the outside record holds is the formal description and the ceremonial context, accurately documented within the limits of what Hunt chose to transfer. What the community holds is the rest. George Hunt died in 1933. He left behind an extraordinary archive of correspondence, collected texts, and translated materials. Researchers continue to work with it today. He also left behind, in that archive, the visible outline of what he did not give. The gaps in the correspondence are themselves a kind of document. The questions Boas asked that Hunt answered obliquely. The specific points about the Sisiutl's territorial associations that never made it into the published record despite years of pursuit. The moments where the correspondence goes quiet on exactly the topics Boas had been most insistent about. Those gaps mark the boundary of the outside record. They show exactly where Hunt drew the line, and they show that he drew it consistently, deliberately, and without wavering for nearly 4 decades of correspondence with one of the most persistent ethnographers of his era. That line is still there. It runs between what the museum collections contain and what the communities hold. It runs between what the 1897 publication describes and what the correspondence acknowledges was withheld. It runs between the Sisiutl, as the outside world has inherited it, and the Sisiutl as the Kwakwaka'wakw actually used it. The outside world received a creature of specific formal description and broad ceremonial significance. The Kwakwaka'wakw held a functional element of a territorial knowledge system. That system's operational dimensions were never given to the outside record. The one-man position to give them chose not to. Franz Boas returned to Kwakwaka'wakw territory multiple times after 1895. He continued to work with Hunt until Hunt's death. The Sisiutl appeared in their correspondence repeatedly over nearly 4 decades of collaboration. Each time Boas pressed for specificity about the creature's territorial role, Hunt redirected. Each time Boas asked about the geography of the threshold zones, the specific boundary spaces where the Sisiutl was understood to be active. Hunt gave him the ceremony and withheld the map. The ceremony is in the archive. The map is not. In the years after the 1897 publication, Boas received accounts from other researchers who had encountered Sisiutl testimony in different communities. Some differed from what he had published in the creature's relationship to specific bodies of water, in the conditions under which transformation occurred. Boas forwarded these to Hunt and asked him to account for the variations. Hunt's responses were careful. He acknowledged the variations without explaining them. In some cases, he attributed them to community-specific knowledge he was not positioned to adjudicate. In others, he changed the subject. The pattern held. What Hunt knew, he knew precisely. What he chose not to transfer, he protected without exception. What that means for anyone trying to understand the Sisiutl through the outside record is this. You are working with a document that was deliberately shaped at the moment of its creation by someone who understood it more completely than the record reflects. The testimony Boas captured was genuine. It was also edited, not by Boas, but by the man who gave it. Edited in the only way available to him under the circumstances, by giving what could be given and holding what could not. An outside record that acknowledged its own partiality from the moment it was made. Not as a flaw, as a decision. The 1884 ban created the conditions. Hunt's decision defined the outcome. And the creature at the center of it, two heads facing opposite directions, a body crossing threshold zones without disturbing the surface, remains exactly as described, in the objects, in the archive, and in the knowledge that was never given to either. More than a century has passed since Boas published the testimony Hunt gave him. The formal properties of the Sisiutl are well documented. The ceremonial contexts are catalogued. The objects are photographed, measured, and held in storage across multiple continents. The outside record has done what outside records do. It preserved what it was given access to. What it cannot contain is the part that was withheld. Not because the withholding was a failure, because the withholding was a decision, made by someone with full knowledge of what was at stake, under conditions that made the decision not just defensible, but necessary. The Sisiutl that exists in the published record is accurate as far as it goes. It doesn't go as far as the creature actually extends. That gap is not a research problem. It is the record of a boundary drawn by the people who had the right to draw it. The boundary is still there. The creature is still on the other side of it.